We're here at the BFI National Archive and we're here to answer some of your questions about the restoration of Hitchcock's 9 surviving silent films. So, first question comes from Dial M for Movies, sent in via Twitter. How is it possible that 9 of Hitchcock's films ended up in such a poor state, considering the status of his work? This is a good question. There are 2 parts to this, really. One is that all film deteriorates, all film, and they're over 80 years old. So the poor condition of some of the original source material is just inherent in the state of how film behaves and decomposes over time. The other part of the question about the status of Hitchcock's work, it was really only much later that Hitchcock became the mega superstar director that we know and love today. Really in the 60s, I think it was Andrew Sarris put him right at the top of his pantheon of world's greatest directors. So the reputation of the films comes later. Another part of the question actually says, did the Hitchcock estate themselves have any prints of his earlier work that you were able to use? And the answer to that is a simple no. Not to my knowledge, and certainly none of the silent films. The silent films are a problem because you can't show them until much later on. Really quite recently there's been a reinvention of silent film because you couldn't project them. The orchestra that played the music was no longer in the cinema, and retrospectives are a recent invention.
Gary Lutz asks, what will be the main material basis for the restorations? Are you using the original camera negatives, prints?
Well, in the most cases we've been using nitrate prints, but for Champagne we actually have an original camera negative. The only problem with that one is that it's not the actual finished edit. So there are a few scenes in a slightly different order and a few unmade dissolves. But because we have no other material, everything that we've seen for this was made from that negative. We've got nothing else to compare it against. So if there is a different edit out there somewhere, then we haven't seen it.
Blackmail is another title that we worked from the original negatives, which were generally in good condition. In reels 1 and 8 there was some damage, but fortunately we have a print that was made of the negative before this damage occurred, that we can take the scenes and drop them in at a later stage. Gary also asks, are you working with varying versions and edits of the films?
Well, we do find different scenes in different copies occasionally, and in the case of the Pleasure Garden we found a couple of different edits, even down to the fact that they have 2 different endings. So in this case it's not just as straightforward as editing together the longest version that we can possibly make, because what we want to do is edit together the most authentic version that audiences would have seen at the time. And this requires a lot of research into things like finding out what the original running time of the film was, and also looking into any reviews, articles that were printed to get any kind of clues as to the content of the original version.
Also another good example was The Ring. After looking at quite a few copies of The Ring, we got a copy over from France, and when I examined it against our material, it was put together in a different edit, but not only in a different edit, but every scene was a different take to our version as well.
We have a question here from Daniel Majerovic. There is a common agreement that Hitchcock's early work informed all of the director's subsequent films. Will you consider augmenting your screenings with Hitchcock's silent films with a compilation of the best silent passages from his later sound films? This is a really interesting question. I like this a lot. It's about what we can learn about Hitchcock's filmmaking style from looking at his silent films, and how he learned to tell a story in pictures, which he continues to do right through his sound work, right to the end of his career. I'm thinking of an example really from North by Northwest, the famous crop duster passage where, if you recall, it's a lengthy sequence where you've just got a single man in a landscape, Cary Grant, and almost no sound at all, and just the hum of a plane as it comes over, creating an aura of menace. There's a fantastic scene with no dialogue in it whatsoever. Now, how does this relate to his silent film? Did he learn this as a silent filmmaker, how to use images to convey his story and mood? And I think that's really one of the main purposes of our restoration project, is to begin to invite those comparisons by bringing them back to audiences.
Did the films originally have any Tintin in them that is not seen in current versions? If so, are you restoring that Tintin? And if you are, how are you making the choices for the colours?
Well, Downhill and the Pleasure Garden are only available at the moment in black and white version. So we will be restoring the original tints and tones. In some cases, the tone sections have become rather patchy, but luckily we've been able to borrow some other prints on loan, where the tinting is still a very vivid blue, and we'll be using that as the reference when we come to restore the tints and tones digitally. In the case of Downhill, there's some very interesting tints, especially in a scene towards the end of the film where the main character is on a boat and is suffering from seasickness and delusions, and everything that he sees is sort of represented with a very sickly sort of green tint.
We're here in one of the largest film vaults at the BFI National Archive. It's nice and cold and dry in here, which is great for the films over the long term. And the next question is about the original running speeds of the film. Are they a mystery to us at all, the original intended running speeds?
A little bit, yes. There's no direct documentary evidence for the running speed of any of the Hitchcock silent films, so there's nothing written down. The general rule of thumb is the earlier the film, the slower the speed. So by about the 1920s in Britain, most films would have been shot at roughly between 18 and 20 frames a second. By the end of the silent period, when Hitchcock's making Blackmail, for example, I think it's getting closer to 22 to 24 frames a second. So we know a lot about contemporary running speeds, but not about those films in particular.
And when we've reached the final point of the restoration, if we make the film available in digital cinema or on Blu-ray, for example, we would need to match those original slower running speeds to the new standards, so that we preserve the integrity of the motion and the action within the original film, while presenting the images in the best quality in these new media.
Next question from Besieger of Cities. Do you digitise the film first, then restore the images, or do you stabilise the stock and then transfer it onto a more stable stock?
That's a really good question. And it gets straight to some of the early choices we're making. All the films will be digitised, be scanned. You know, the whole of each film will be scanned so that the images can be restored, each frame. But in order to get to that stage, you are making decisions about whether to scan original nitrate elements or to print them first, which is really the form of stabilising and transforming it. One of the things that we bear in mind is film scanners, which have been designed initially for transferring brand new films. A lot of work has been done so that you now have scanners like the one here at the National Archive, which are capable of handling pretty fragile materials, but they still need a lot of care to go through those scanners and to ensure that any deterioration of the film doesn't prevent a good scan, because that sharpness and definition can't be recaptured if you don't get it in the first place. So we're doing both is the honest answer, and we scan as many sources as we need to, and then if separate film printing work is needed, we carry that out as well.
We have a question here from Twittykins via YouTube. Very interesting question, this one. At what point do you decide that the film has finally been restored and that progressing further would become a form of editing? Interesting question.
Yeah, very. I mean, that's. I think the most important thing is to do all your research and physical inspection and comparison of all the different physical copies early on and thoroughly, so that you get a good sense of what was intended by the filmmakers, what's happened to the individual copies in the history of their distribution, and what we can do with our knowledge of film and digitisation techniques to bring them back to that intended release. Once you've got a good sense of what you're heading for, then you're obviously more sure when you've reached it.
So there are some interesting decisions that have to be made, but they're nearly all decisions which are not really a form of editing. What they are is based on a good knowledge of filmmaking of the period. Hitchcock, we know, has excellent continuity. So if there's a continuity mistake, we know that that's wrong. Hitchcock just wouldn't do that. So most of the decisions are relatively easy. You would very rarely be forced into editing Hitchcock, which is a thing that we wouldn't want to do. So at that point, we'll just represent what we already have from the source material. Thanks very much for all your questions. If you want to know a bit more, or we haven't answered your question, go to bfi.org.uk and we'll try and answer them more fully there.